half of the conference with a panel entitled Journalistic Objectivity, Wishful Thinking. I invite the moderator and the speakers of the next panel discussion to join me on the stage. Let me introduce you the moderator of the next discussion, Rodrigo Ballester. He is the head of the Center for European Studies at MCC. Please join me on the stage.
Well, the others as well. So basically, we first welcome Dr. Zoltán Szalai, who is the director, one of the bosses here at MCC, and also the editor-in-chief of Mandiner. Let me also call on the stage Ed West, please. Please join us. Whatever you want, yes. Matthew Tyrmand, please join us as well. And Stefano Magni. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I just received from my former colleagues of the European Commission the new guidelines on inclusive communication that they just drafted and circulated to the 35,000 civil servants, basically, and you're no longer allowed to say ladies and gentlemen. So, that's why, and by the way, we are not a panel today, according to them, we are a manel. Because we only have men on stage. So basically in Brussels, this panel would have never existed. And if it would have existed, it would have been sabotaged or boycotted by all the audience. So I'm very happy to have a panel here. And if you want, I can also volunteer to be a woman for 1 hour. So that we have... No. This is my gender identity. And so here we are. So thank you very much. So today we're going to speak about basically probably the oldest question that we have now since journalism exists, that has been already touched upon by some of the other panels, by the way, objectivity. Can journalists be objective? But that's not the question, because that's more for philosophers, and this is a question that is, again, some thousands of years old. But the question is whether this quest for objectivity has been totally altered by the digital age, for good or for bad. And so basically this is the main question that we're going to touch upon. That's going to lead us to speak about fact-checkers, about pluralism, about wokeism. Does wokeism actually makes it worse or not? And so for all those questions, we have all those distinguished speakers, panelists. Many, many thanks. I will introduce you very, very quickly. Zoltán Szalai. So today you come here with your hat of editor-in-chief of Mandiner, which is one of the most important weekly magazines here in Hungary. Üdvözöljük, welcome. Ed West, also a journalist, editor-in-chief of Unheard, and you also had a very, very extensive career before. So you're coming from the UK, from a third country, but still very, very welcome here as well. Matthew Tyrmand, you're American. You have so many hats that I only can mention one today, which is your a very active role in this Project Veritas. Basically, if I understand well, you try also to watch the fact checkers, you know, and maybe to also kill some of the myths behind. And last but not least, from Italy, Stefano Magni, who is also a journalist at Nuova Bussola Quotidiano, like the New Compass. And we're also going to speak about, you know, like this quest for objectivity. So as John O'Sullivan said this morning already, objectivity is something that everyone pursues, but never really reaches. But at the end of the day, and we'll start with you, Stefano, so each one of you will get a specific question, but please feel free to react anytime. We have to keep this discussion spontaneous as well. So, Stefano, objectivity in the digital age, is it worse? Is it better than before?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, welcome. And first of all, objectivity in journalism never existed. I am subjective, he is subjective, everyone is subjective. And I think that there is only one difference. There is the honest journalist who declares its position, who declares his ideas, and separate the opinion from the facts. And this is the honest journalist. The dishonest journalist is someone who is hiding his own opinion, and he never separates the facts from the opinion. I think that with the internet age, many of those journalists which pretend to be neutral or to be only objective had to lift their mask, and they are unmasked, and they had to declare their own opinion, because the feedback is immediate in internet, and their readers and the internet users pretend to understand what is your opinion, and they pretend from you to be loyal to your own opinion. So we see that many large newspaper and large media company which pretended to be neutral or had a balanced opinion between the left and the right, now are clearly on the left, and they have to declare it. Think, for example, to the main Italian newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, declared his support for the leftist candidate already in 2006. And the New York Times in 2016 made a very interesting editorial in which it stated that it is not possible to be not partisan, and the line between the facts and opinion does not exist anymore. We have to express our opinion, we have to take one side, and this is an effect of the internet age, and I don't think it's negative, because you are obliged to be clear what is your ideas, what is your opinion, and then it's the user or it's the reader that decide to read you or not. So I think that with internet we have much more transparency. Of course, there is a dark side of it, and I conclude immediately. The dark side is personalization. The dark side is the radicalization of opinions. There are no more balanced opinion or centrist opinion, but we see that there is a radicalization process. But at least we have to declare what we are thinking.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Stefano. It's actually puzzling, because the general point of view on the internet is that it turned journalism into a wild west. And you seem to say that actually it also brings this positive side, that at least people have to write without their masks on and cannot no longer pretend. But what do the other panelists think about it? Because in terms, for example, of spreading of fake news, for example, of mixing opinions and information, I mean, does really internet help you being more honest? Matthew, you want to intervene, please?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you said about journalism being a subjective venture, because we all have our opinions and we all have our embedded confirmation biases. That's part of human nature. And fundamentally, the first confirmation bias is, what stories does a journalist cover? And so we see huge bias in the omission of stories that aren't covered, and even within stories that are covered, the omission of relevant fact pattern. And that's where I think the mainstream media, in becoming so partisan and activist in practicing their craft, really achieves a lot of their end goals, which is the curation of the fact pattern. What they omit is so integral to giving a full context so people can be informed and make a decision. But I will push back on one thing, which is that there is a format of journalism that is not subjective, that is objective, and that is when the subject of the story is seen in real time. And that's what Project Veritas does. That is a cinema verite. When you have the story in front of you and you see the subject's mouth moving and you see their activity, especially when it's unbeknownst to them that they are being recorded, that they are the subject of a story. Then you see the real masks come down and you see the real behaviors, which are the most important things to take away the obfuscation from, to demonstrate to the public. And that is why what Project Veritas does is so dangerous to the establishment, and that's why we've been in the news lately, because of the things that we have uncovered, things like election fraud and ballot harvesting, ballot stuffing, even something that is become a cause célèbre among the center in the U.S., which is the critical race theory teachings to students, where out-of-control radicals are indoctrinating students. Well, all we had to do was get teachers on tape with their Stalinism and their Marxism and their Che Guevaraism and pushing this radicalism. And when you can contextualize it for the masses, that it's not just because there's so many handmaidens of the radicals who say, oh no, if anything that's proven even on some level that these dynamics exist, oh, that's de minimis, it's so small. Well, if you can film it over and over and over again, you start to change the narrative. And so I really do believe in what Project Veritas does. I think it's pulled back the curtain on so many egregious things, and that's why we are a target, and I encourage, in the U.S., because of the First Amendment and consent laws, what we do is allowable right now in 39 states, soon Massachusetts as well will be the 40th state. One-way consent allows, if I am talking to any of you in a private room and I decide to release the audio or the video, that is legally allowable under the First Amendment. In Europe, unfortunately, and most countries in the world, without that robust freedom of speech framework in place, like the First Amendment, it's not legal. And I get requests all over the world, especially in Europe, where I also live part-time, please do this here. And unfortunately, I can't. And I think that that would elevate the journalistic game if the mainstream and the established media oligarchies had that competition. We see what's happening in the U.S. when we do what we do. They attack us, which when we become the story, it means that our stories are breaking through.
You seem to also to be very positive about it. So basically, internet brought more, basically broke the oligopoly. And that can only be a good thing. I don't know, Ed, what are your thoughts on that? Maybe, I don't know, maybe somebody can be negative.
I'm a pessimist by nature, being a conservative, so yeah, I think British as well. Overall, I think the internet was probably a mistake, but there's nothing we can do about that now. I do think, what we're talking about here is nothing new, but it's an acceleration of previous trends. So, the New York Times has always been the voice of liberal America. There's nothing new.
The New York Times, no?
The New York Times, yeah, but there's New York Times has always been on the left, and the Manchester Guardian, as it's called abroad, and the Daily Telegraph is on the right. And what I think we've seen in the past few years is just an acceleration of these patterns, where sorts of previous checks, and they're not even legal, they're just kind of like cultural checks, where it would have been considered bad form for journalists to be so openly biased. They've slightly gone out the window in the English-speaking world anyway. So we see the New York Times has become much more accelerated, much more overtly political. I do think it's a bad thing. There's no perfect impartiality, there's no perfect objectivity, but there are degrees of it, as there are degrees of anything. And there was a time when journalists did at least strive, at least pretend to be impartial. Which is why, you're going to think it's very British, but, I'm not very optimistic about US-style media patterns happening in Britain with, we have a sort of a national broadcaster which is technically impartial. It has a left liberal bias because that's the way it's always been. And if that becomes replaced with competing left v right media, as happens in the States, it's going to be like a new reformation. It's going to be people screaming at each other, these two different visions of the world, and it's not going to be very pleasant.
Exactly, yeah? So it can also bring more polarization to the society.
Oh, yeah, definitely more polarizations, and I think probably more stupidity as well, which is what I fear as well.
Thank you, Ed. And Zoltán, maybe from a Hungarian point of view, do you have the impression that in the last 30 years, and in the landscape that was heavily dominated by the left for years and years and years, did internet help reach a better balance?
I think all in all, Hungary has a very different historical development, just like different than the United States, the UK or Italy, because till 1990 we had communism, so we had a communist dictatorship in Hungary with the one-party system. And it was combined that all the media houses and all the media outlets were in the hand of the Communist Party, were in the hand of the communist state. So basically, from a process of how press started in Hungary, we can calculate it from 1990. But even after 1990. A large part of the media houses, all of them were privatized, so private companies and private investors, mainly German, Austrian, Swiss and US private investors invested and bought these media houses. But of course, if you invest money into something, what do you want to have? Do you want to take your revenue? Do you want, if you buy a media house or you buy a newspaper, do you want to change the whole troupe and start with the new one who never did previously a newspaper? Because after a dictatorship, that would be the nice way to restart the media. Or you keep the old people who are doing media for 30 years. They have their readership, they have their knowledge, they have their experience. Of course, you do the second one. So that was the situation in Hungary, that there was a change in the political system, but in the media system, 90% still left-wing, still the former communist journalists and editors could keep their positions, and I would say about 10%. I would say about 10% was liberal or conservative in those years, and it was for about 2 decades this situation. And after at about 2010 started a different process when we have now, as I see, a situation of 40 to 60, so for 40% conservative or conservative liberal and 60% left-wing or left-wing liberal, what we have in the Hungarian media. But we have a much larger, the largest pluralism in these years that we ever had since the change of the political system. And if we look on the special segments of the market, the number one television, private television, is more left-wing. The number two is more right-wing. If you look on the news station, the number one news station is more left-wing. Then the number two is more right-wing. If you look, the largest daily newspaper is left-wing. The second largest is right-wing. From the weekly newspapers, the first two are left-wing, but there are also right-wing newspapers. In the internet, we have more left-wing media, which is much bigger. So from the top 5 news sites, I would say 4 are left-wing and only 1 is right-wing. But it's not 90 to 10 as we had it 30 years ago, and there is a slide. And I think if we have plural media houses, if we have different newspapers with different opinions, that helps for the reader that I can click to that site and to the other site as well.
Thank you, Zoltán. And let's move maybe to another topic now that again has been a little bit discussed, but I think today now we, at least in this panel, we can go a bit more into details. One of the things that internet brought, and actually recently, are the fact checkers. And fact checkers, they portray themselves as basically referees, but the question I'm asking now is whether are they clarifying or are they blurring the lines? Are they judge and party, or are they only judged? And for that, maybe I will give you the floor now, Matthew, because it seems that one of the aims of Project Veritas is also to fact check the fact checkers.
Totally. And the fact checkers are a natural evolution that springs from your previous question about has the internet been healthy and good? And my argument is yes, it's democratized journalism and media because a printing press is not free. but the internet and posting words is, and the distribution that social media gave us to distribute those blogs, and anybody could become a citizen journalist. And technology obviously has led to now, we have an army of citizen journalists because we have iPhones that can film in real time, and technology has compressed the cost of things like equipment. But that democratization, that more and more people could become journalists, could create blogs and break stories, that is what has, and then distribute through social media, that is what has led to this competition that has sent the establishment media, the mainstream media, over the edge and has pushed them more toward radicalism, because now with the competition, they have to push back. We were reactionaries, we reacted to the way they behaved, and now that's pushing them further. And so their newest innovation to push back on us winning many of these battles in the war of ideas and the culture war is the fact checker. The fact checker is a 5-6-year-old innovation that was stimulated first by quote-unquote independents that were connected to newspapers like the Washington Post, and they would fact check what was on the internet. They had things like Snopes. And of course, a fact checker is still a person, and a person has biases, so you have the same embedded problem. But the evolution of the fact checking has gotten so pervasive and pernicious that the social media companies now have built out their fact checking machines. Where do you think they get their fact checkers from? Anybody here heard of George Soros? No, okay. Maybe it's pronounced Soros. So one of his many projects and connected tentacles of left-wing radicalism is the Southern Poverty Law Center. Many of the fact-checkers come from the SPLC. What do you think their embedded bias is? And it's we went up against one, we are up against one right now that the New York Times has been using, the Stanford Internet Observatory. Sounds innocuous, sounds academic. It's not. It is filled with ivory tower academic leftists who have a very strong ideological view, and they fact-check us in ways that were so cartoonish and that was cited by the New York Times. We're suing the New York Times for defamation. We did an investigation on voter fraud in Minnesota, in Ilhan Omar's district, among the Somali community there. It's been known for decades that it goes on. We get video of ballots exchanging hands for cash. They then go on the mainstream news and say, oh, we were just raising money for a sick kid in Somalia, which flies in the face of our cinema verite, something that is, do you trust them or do you trust your own eyes and ears? And so they start running out these tautologies. The Stanford Internet Observatory talks about us. The New York Times quotes them. USA Today quotes the New York Times. They have their own fact checkers. Facebook signs a contract with the same group from the USA Today fact-checking group, and all of a sudden we're banned on social media. Or these posts have giant warning labels, warning misinformation. Now, if you just click through and see the video, you'll see, again, it's cinema verite, it's live action. You can see it with your own eyes and ears. But it's very Orwellian because they make you second guess what you're seeing and hearing with your own eyes and ears. And so this is, it's because of, this last question we discussed, the democratization that the internet's brought to media, that they've now had to iterate out this fact-checking mechanism. And the fact-checking mechanism is a weapon. It's a weapon to push back against things they do not like, the inconvenient truths that alter their agenda and their narrative. We, I think, are probably the #1 fact-check organization on earth. Maybe Donald J. Trump was pretty regularly fact-checked for 4 years. And again, with omission and curation of relevant fact patterns, something that would put the agenda first and forefront, not the truth. So I do think that more people are aware of it, and they see that even fact-checking is highly subjective. And then when you can break through and give people real data, primary source documents or primary source evidence like cinema verite, then it will further undermine these fact-checking machines that are being built to reinforce the narrative and get us off social media.
Thank you, Matthew. Let me play also the devil's advocate here, because what strikes me is that if at the end nothing can be checked, and I don't know whether also the others want to react on that, we also enter into a type of relativism, even factual relativism or information relativism, that actually is going to lead to massive distrust. So I don't know how the others feel about it. I mean, the problem maybe is that the fact-checkers didn't do their job, or that their job was actually manipulated and hijacked. But real fact-checkers in this area where information is flowing and flowing, Isn't it a good idea? I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Ed, Zoltán, Stefano?
I mean, yeah, the question is, there are people to fact check the fact checkers without getting too complicated. Who fact checks you? And it's a similar thing with alternative media of various sorts. Has its role to keep an eye on what the mainstream media is not saying. But what happens if you're sort of just a neutral, apolitical person? I just want to get to the nub of this story, and so I'm presented with two kind of wildly different views of it. And partisanship means that they push each other further away from any kind of objective truth, and polarization has that effect where inevitably editorial standards in a smaller organization can never be as I'm sure you do a great job, but compared to a large organization where there are systems in place, this is the kind of Catholic in me. You need to have a hierarchy to kind of make sure there aren't these sort of crazies. Inevitably, standards are going to be lower in small organizations in terms of factual accuracies and stuff like that. So the overall quality of what people get in terms of truth is just going to go down, isn't it? If there's polarization, I know you probably can't stop that because you're a product of it, but you're probably also the accelerant of it. So
all we do is put people's words and their actions for other people to see in the first person. We don't actually write about it. We don't say, well, this person did this because the wind blew this way, and there's no room for editorialization in what we do. Nothing. The argument that the left would say is that we manipulate and edit. We've never taken an edit out of context ever. James goes on makes statements all the time and says, I'll give $10,000 to the charity of any journalist's choice if you can name one edit. In 12 years of work, hundreds of videos, tens of thousands of hours, no one's ever found an edit. That was out of context.
Your editorial decisions also reflect your political position. You wouldn't deny that either.
When we see something malfeasant, we take that video and we put it online.
I mean, I didn't know. That's an editorial decision, sure. Like Snopes, which started out as a kind of quite very interesting, fact-checking thing, is the Urban Myth website has now become a kind of like a joke, sort of. Yes, but it's obviously very biased, like everyone, and it's almost.
I think that the real question, if with this kind of fact-checking, it's easier or more harder to defend yourself from defamation in internet age. I think that with the internet age, it's easier to defend yourself because you can show the proof. We are harassed as a newspaper by the fact checkers for many times. And it was quite easy for us to defend ourselves because, for example, home treatment for COVID is a very sensitive matter in Italy. And there was a physician who was also a contributor of our newspaper who treated a lady which was considered lost by a hospital, and he treated her. And he managed to put her on her legs again. So he saved her life, and he wrote his experience. And immediately there were fact-checkers agencies that attacked us. And they told that it was not true because it's impossible to treat COVID at home because this is the main truth. Ministerial truth. There is no cure for COVID, but we could easily demonstrate that it was true. The daughter of the lady contacted that agency, and she explained directly that her mother is actually alive, and he was treated by that physician, so it's true. They didn't renounce immediately, of course. They told something like, it's not a professional way of narrating the news because you had to contact also the hospital. But at least they had to renounce to consider our news as fake news. And I can bring you many other examples. I think that in internet age, everyone can check also the fact checkers and reply to their accusations. So I think now it's better than before. Before, when you have only paper or radio or TV, if the state news media, like the Hungarian one during the communist people, told one thing, told fake news, that was the truth, and you cannot do nothing about it. But now it's possible to defend yourself, and very quickly, indeed.
No, it's indeed very interesting. So yet another positive point. I don't know what is your point of view there, Zoltán. What I also understand from Matthew's comments, that at the end of the day, maybe, this internet is also leading us to do like very type of brutal information, like non-processed information, raw information. I don't know whether it is the case, but again, I don't know on fact checkers. I mean, what is your point of view, Zoltán?
I think in my opinion, the best solution is if you have a plural media. So if there are, especially in internet, different sources, and it's always very interesting if the one newspaper is telling one thing, the other one will react, and then it goes on and on and on, and then finally, I think the readers and the people will see and can see which newspaper or which media outlet is telling more true, which is telling less true. For me, it's more difficult if someone. So I don't think that the largest problem is this. There is a wrong fact, because what are you talking about is probably more important. If you cover how much percentage of the topics you cover in your newspaper, that's probably more biased or more telling about the newspaper than if someone is trying to make a wrong fact. Because the wrong fact it's there, you can prove it that it was not true, and then if you do it several times, then this newspaper will be not serious anymore and people will not take it seriously. More interesting for me is how much percentage of the topics you cover in the newspaper. And you would be surprised. Some newspapers, you think they are very serious, and how small percentage of the topics that are in a society are covered by these newspapers. So I think these are probably more important and more interesting topics for myself.
No, thank you. That's maybe one of the concrete solutions that we can propose at the end, because my last question to all of you is, please give us concrete solutions to improve maybe objectivity, maybe pluralism, maybe honesty on the digital world. A little parenthesis, again, yes, you can also ask your questions. We'll have time for you as well on Slido. I will press the right button, and then we will also take a couple of your questions. You already insinuated the next point, some of you. It's normal because it's really the elephant in the room of the political life today. It's like this wokeism craze, this epidemic. I think is sometimes worse than the COVID. At least it looks like a virus as well. In the US, especially in Western Europe, very much so as well. In Central and Eastern Europe, thank God, less for the time being, and we trust it can remain like that. But Ed, that's a question for you. I mean, does this wokeism, exacerbate all the defaults and all the cleavages the polarization that we already highlighted? Does it make your life as a journalist much more complicated, or actually is something you can deal with?
Well, I mean, something happens. What people call woke is basically an ideology that's kind of became notable around 2012, 2013, when opinion amongst American, you might call it the American upper middle class, the highly educated Americans, radically shifted in a very, very short space of time, mainly on these kind of hot topic, kind of identity issues, race, immigration, gender, and it's identifiable in the New York Times on the data in their use of certain keywords, things like white privilege, transphobia, which have gone up by over 1,000% in some cases, or even 2,000%, huge increase in these terms. And so this has been linked to the invention of the smartphone, which has basically, it's had the same effect that printing had 500 years ago. What does this ideology mean? It's really just an accelerated version of, the progressivism which has been sort of around since the 1960s, but a much, much more hardline vision, devoted to the ideas of equality of outcomes between different groups, different race groups, different genders, how many genders they believe there are, a kind of denial of biological human nature, but a strong belief in the blank slate, and a very, very kind of religious determination to make the world a better place. And this came to fruition last year with these sort of protests that followed the George Floyd killing, which spread all over the world in some very bizarre ways. People sort of compared it to, tribal leaders in Gaul or Britannia imitating, the Romans.
Football players.
Yeah, it's footballers. It's everywhere, and it's different. It's not liberalism. So, it's a form of progressivism. It's really against the principles of liberalism, which was a very American idea, because it's quite hostile to opposing beliefs. It's hostile to freedom of speech. Most importantly, even more important than freedom of speech, which is never really spoken about so much, is freedom of association, which there are laws against in the English-speaking world now, and there have been for quite a long time, and there have been since the 60s. And as Christopher Caldwell said, freedom of association is the master freedom. Without it, there is nothing. And I was reading an interview with the first reformist Hungarian prime minister from late 1988. I think it's Nemet's name. And he said, we want what the West have. And the first thing he mentions is freedom of association, even before freedom of speech. So wokeism is very against those ideas. And because it has a very strong religious vision of the world, as it should be, that translates into journalism, which, you cannot... Journalism is about accepting the world as it is, and it's a bad place, and we're all terrible people. And that's really noticeable in the New York Times in particular, which is which is the cheerleader of this ideology.
Some call it the new woke Times, no?
Yeah, right.
A newspaper that decides to write white with a small letter and black with a capital letter.
So the problem with stuff like that, or the problem with the pronouns thing, is fine. You can say whatever you like. If people want to say I identify as she, her, whatever, that's fine. But it turns out to be a sort of profession of belief. And so if you don't say it, you stand out. You're making a statement. And so, the publication I worked at before, I just said, I'm not going to capitalize B. I'm not going to allow that. Because that's a statement. It's just absurd if one is captain and the other is not. But most things just fall in line. You think like the American dictionaries, for example, this is just very weird the way the Webster just immediately changes its definition. It was not just a capped up thing, but it changes definition, things like racism, misogyny, very quickly. Almost, it's kind of overnight thing, and it's a very, very quick change. And I'm still reading it thinking, well, I didn't decide that. When was that debate? When was that decided upon? We're all going to just change like a bunch of lemmings. It's just, it's very quick, and it's very quick because the people making these decisions just don't seem to have that kind of sense of doubt that this is the right thing to do.
Exactly. It reminds me the new guidelines of the European Commission, the inclusive communication that I just mentioned at the beginning. I will send them to you. They are priceless. Speaking precisely, I also would like to have the opinion of the other speakers on this phenomenon of wokeism. So maybe we can do it from the more wokist countries where you come from to the less. And my guess would be Matthew first, US, maybe Stefano somewhere in between. And let me assume that Hungary is a bit woker than the rest.
Well, America is leading on wokeism. Wonderful. Our corporate sector is certainly leading on it and pushing it around the world. The whole idea of wokeism is an elitism. Working class people who are just trying to make a wage and put food on the table don't really care about your pronouns. They've got much more serious considerations. So there's something very indulgent about it. It's, only the wealthiest society in the history of the world could indulge such flippancy and this sort of war with reality. The idea, and we're talking about journalism, that you said that we have to, journalists want to report the facts, but where do you see that? You see them cheerleading and championing these ideals. So there's a straying from journalism. Journalism, like any other discipline, it fits along a spectrum, like most dynamics. And the real heart of journalism is like the old, for Americans or people who remember the old show Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. Just put the facts and let people take away from that what they will. On the other end of the spectrum is editorialism. And most journalism, for instance, the New York Times, they say they've separated the journalist side, the news gathering, reporting side of the business with the editorial side. But we're suing the New York Times because they merged it. They actually put their opinions into a news story on page 1 about this investigation. And then when we sued them and we filed in court, their first response on a motion to dismiss was, oh no, that was just an opinion. And the judge dismissed this motion and allowed the case to go forward because he said the normal conception in our society is there's news gathering, that's the news side, and there's editorial. You're saying there's editorialization, so that should exempt you from this defamation case. That does not fly. So, the same people who are telling you gender is a social construct are trying to feed you the fact pattern in the mainstream news narratives. You should be very, very leery of that. And I know maybe getting ahead on the sort of prescription, what Zoltán was saying I found really, really, really good, which was the idea of competition, the idea of pluralism in media. If we're going to be essentially stalemated by disputing the fact patterns, what facts do we include in our respective curations, then competition is the healthiest answer. And it's not new. Socrates coined a whole method for education on this, is iterating out through questions and debate. So I think that is the answer, and that I think is the way that we're going to battle back against wokeism. Now keep in mind, those who buy ink by the barrel have trended toward the progressive liberal, not the classical liberal. They've been activists. Journalists go to J school because they want to make the world a better place. No journalist goes to journalism school because they just want to report the news. They want to make the world a better place. So just look at that supposition of what their vocation is going to be. It is going to be an active role. An active role makes you an activist. And that's what we've seen in journalism, certainly throughout the last 60, 70 years, the countercultural revolution in the 60s. It went on steroids. And then it got worse, as I alluded to before, when that was democratized with the internet in the 90s, and we could push back. The good thing is in our society, there is healthy, and Hungary and Poland and Central Europe coming out of communism, knowing systems that were at war with truth. My father used to write about, he was an anti-communist dissident in Poland and writer, he used to say that, Stalin tells us it's a record crop yield this year, but why are we starving? Do you believe the propaganda, or do you believe your rumbling belly? And most people, and by the way, the woke are so radical that they would believe the propaganda over their rumbling belly. We see that even with the idea that gender is a social construct. So I'm diverging to a few points here, but the fact is that most of the Western societies do have a healthy dichotomy between those who believe their rumbling belly versus those who are telling them, no, record crop yields. So I do agree with Zoltán's prescription that competition will help us diffuse some of the fallacious fact pattern spinning.
Thank you, Matthew. No, very, very good points. Indeed, the question about objectivity for journalists is that in some faculties of medicine, they can no longer teach that you have male and females. That's objectivity.
That's not going to lead to good outcomes.
Exactly. Those can be objective, at least. It's not like journalists who try but never manage. But that must also have an influence on journalism. Stefano, how is it in Italy?
In Italy, I think that wokeism is still a limited phenomenon. But it's growing because in Italy, the wokeism is not really about race or about other clearly American things, but it's about Christianity and Christian culture. So the wokeism is mainly an anti-Christian. And from the old international left, the new intersectional left, it's very close. It's a very little step to change. But I think that we can fight back, but we have to fight back immediately because this is another kind of threat to free speech. They are not only changing our opinion, they are trying to change our language. So if you try to separate the facts from opinions, like a good journalist, good honest journalist, with the wokeism you cannot anymore, because changing the language, they are clearly erasing a lot of facts, and because they are changing the way to describe them, and that's the main danger, I think. And also, if you see in, of course, as we previously said, also in United States, we have also scientific universities which are erasing a lot of material from their lessons and from their courses, because you cannot state, for example, the most ridiculous example, which is used also in Italy, is that some kind of protest contribute to spread the COVID, but other kinds of protests are almost healing, maybe, because if we have the traditional unions that invade and flood the streets of Rome, it's a healing experience, and nobody speaks about COVID. But if you have very fewer people that are protesting against the COVID pass, it's dangerous for the health. And that's the replica of something that we already saw in United States, for example, when the pro-Trump and against the lockdown protesters were considered as dangerous as terrorists. But when Black Lives Matter flooded the cities, it was considered useful to fight against COVID, because the racial problems came before the COVID pandemic. So it's more important to protest against racism, also for the fight against COVID. And that's incredible to read something like that written by scientists and written by physicians or other people that
with study.
Yes. So I think that that's the main danger, because internet or not, they are trying to change the language, and they are trying to change the science also. So they are trying to change the methods to understand the facts and to learn about how they work. And that's the most dangerous fact for the profession of journalism.
Thank you, Stefano. Very, very good point about the language. Maybe by assuming the woke languages, we are actually killing even honesty and objectivity. It's true. That's a very good point. Maybe one that we can put in our list of conclusions. Zoltán, please tell us that we are a little bit less woke in Hungary, please.
I think what I wanted to tell to connect to all of the previous speakers is what I think is a very important question, and a very important that the reality and the facts are very important. And people understand, I think, the reality and the facts. So to follow these are very important. On the other hand, chronology is a fact and is a reality. And all this woke culture and this BLM problematic is about destroying history and about destroying chronology, which are basic basements, so to say, of our society, of our whole life. Sorry?
And about cognition as well.
About cognition as well. So there is this unfortunate fact that our life can be lived only forwards, but to understand life, we only can backwards, and we never can change it. It was 2,000 years ago this way, and it will be in 2,000 years the same. And this BLM question is somehow trying to destroy what we have forever as a very important fact of our life is chronology and history. And I think that is very important that we have to keep these facts, because that is what these things are keeping society together. So these things are keeping the life that we live now together. And BLM and wokeism is just trying to destroy this, because if we don't understand the chronology, how things in our life happened, how the chronology of our society was, which we call history, if we those things don't understand, then we are more able to understand those news. And one more thing that you can see is a huge change if you compare newspapers 20 years ago and now. What are news? Now news are more entertainment with a lot of descriptions and not just facts. When, who, how, why. So this is what contains the news. But if you add it was beautiful, nice, or it was wrong or bad, and you add all these additional informations, your own opinion, to the news, nowadays you really can't recognize that, oh, there was a subjective that told me something, and it was just a short news from a newspaper. So I think this chronology and history, to keep this and to understand this, is very important. And secondly, which is a methodological change in journalism, is what is news. And we shouldn't forget, news is where, when, how, and by whom. And everything else what is added to this, that it is an opinion, is somehow trying to formulate you and trying to glide you to an opinion, which is fine, but it's not fair.
Quickly, please.
Just one point that Zoltán made when he said, the editorialization of language. One of the things I've noticed in the press, I've noticed it certainly when it applies to my organization, leading adjectives. There's a lot of use now of leading adjectives. The recent case that my organization is facing, when I see an MSNBC, which has wrote editorialization from a hard left perspective, they're using words to describe a situation. I won't get too into the details of the situation. Stolen, purloined, burglarized, things that are not part of the fact pattern but create the color, an amorphous sort of storm cloud over the fact pattern, so that those who are led are done so sort of like a horse with a rope. And that has become more and more prevalent. I see that in reportage all the time now, and I just want to scream at the paper for it.
Oh, indeed. No. Thank you, Matthew. Before we turn to the last question, just 2-3 things I wanted to say. The first, that it's now, so we're going to have a very, very short last discussion. Like really, we'll have less than 1 minute each to give concrete solutions. And then we will take also the questions of the audience. 2 other points. One is a very personal one, but I think I lost my backpack here in the big flamenco hotel. So anyone having a black backpack, can you please just open it and make sure that it's not yours? That is actually mine. Basically, maybe somebody took it by mistake. I just have a computer. The rest is really not interesting, believe me. And the second
viral
thing,
moment for YouTube right there.
So please check. Fact check. And the second thing I wanted to say also is to thank all the colleagues that are behind the organization of this conference. When I see this splendid setting and the impeccable organization, I feel extremely proud of working in MCC. So to all the colleagues, köszönöm szépen. Köszönjük szépen, actually. And the last quick round before we take the questions from the floor is let's speak about concrete solutions. Let's start with you, maybe Zoltán. I mean, something that you already implied and you insinuated, that maybe pluralism or competition at the end might be the best solution to reach, or at least to pursue this objectivity. Please, can you elaborate on that, and also to give us some other solutions? You spoke also about this need for chronology, some very, very concrete things. If you had a list of 2 or 3 things that you would recommend to improve the quality of journalism in the digital age, what would that be?
I very much agree with that. Probably other speakers also said that this competition and to see which newspaper, which outlet is doing what and how. But one thing we have to add, and where we have to be very careful, is we shouldn't go into the street of this very high-level political correctness that we often have, because political correctness is often mean that you have to be BLM, you have to be woke, you have to somehow always be a bit more left-lean, and there are also some others who are a bit more right-wing or a bit more conservative, and it's not a problem. So competition is good, but we have to have a common field of where we play, and we have to be very careful that we don't let out this field to that you often can feel and you often can read in different newspapers and in different discussions that if you tell a very harsh opinion, or when you tell out your opinion, if it's a left-wing, far left-wing opinion, it's somehow in the mainstream or on the left part of the mainstream. On the other hand, it can be very dangerous that even for a very soft right-wing opinion, often people are, it's dangerous, don't tell this and be more careful. And if we do this and if we go into this game, then we can't have a proper competition, because competition, we have to have the same rules.
Thank you. Maybe add in 220 characters.
I'm not normally a good solutions person. I like to just complain without offering any useful advice. But I would say, I agree on that front in the sense that there needs to be an alternative, and there needs to be some way of pushing back against the inevitable sort of Overton window always sliding in one direction, which is what inevitably happens. My optimistic take is that one way of looking at wokeism is basically mass-marketed political correctness. It's like a sort of, people who would sort of sneer at most American cultural exports as being sort of trashy, mass-produced rubbish, adopt really trashy, mass-produced opinions from America. And so one aspect of it is that it is very lowbrow, very unintelligent, and I am slightly optimistic that maybe amongst the younger people there'll be a reaction away from it, just because it'll start to seem really stupid, and like people don't want to appear stupid. People want to have a slightly more nuanced opinion. So I think there will be some pushback against it. But people always say this and they're always wrong, so who knows?
Oh, you're right. Maybe the millennials, we can no longer trust them, but maybe those who are younger today, we should have more trust in them. Matthew.
I sort of alluded earlier, I agree 100% with Zoltán that competition and pluralism in media will give the people choices they will put together through their own internal Socratic method, what works, what doesn't, what's honest, what's not, and also that everybody here is a journalist. You have two eyes, you have two ears. You're all journalists. You don't need a union guild card from the New York Times or the Washington Post news desks. We see what they've wrought on society. Gender is not a social construct. Epstein didn't kill himself. Let's go, Brandon. The mainstream media is so advocating for so much that we just have to fight back as individuals who comprise members of the society. And I would just add two things. I highly recommend reading, because it's very germane to this conversation, what Orwell wrote, Politics in the English Language. Unbelievably important essay. It gets on the same points of wokeism that change the definitions of reality, to change your mindset and make you a sheep in total control of the powers that be. And the other essay is Hayek's 1976 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which is The False Pretense of Knowledge. It also fits here. And I'll do one shameless plug beyond watch Project Veritas videos. The last panel talked about social media. I'm working with one that has just launched in the US called Getter, which is the ultimate free speech platform. And we'll be doing a big push in Hungary in the next couple months, like we've done in France, Germany, and the UK. And I urge everyone to take a look at that.
Thank you, Matthew.
Shameless plug.
Stefano, please, very, very quickly.
Yes, as a matter of fact, if you want to find the truth, if you want to search for reality, you have to decentralize the information, because it's quite easy for a central planner to falsify the news and without the possibility to be checked. So you have to decentralize, and internet was a good decentralizator in the first period of existence. But now we have the same problem also in the internet age, because of economic monopolization of internet, and the alliance of economic monopolies with political parties, leftist parties in particular. So I think that the real solution will be only technological. We have to discover a new technology to decentralize even more the information system, an equivalent of blockchain for information. Okay.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. According to the clock, we have 1 minute and a half, but you know I'm the only Spaniard in MCC, so people know I need 5 more minutes. I'm a bit more flexible, so I'll unilaterally add 3 or 4 more minutes to the panel. There are 2 questions I would like to take from the quite a few we received, so allow me to be selective, please. But the first one is precisely on education. You just said, Matthew, that to be a journalist, you don't need to go to the school, but still you have schools of journalism. Why don't we attack the problem in the root, which is basically that the schools of journalism mostly produce left-wing, if not wokist type of journalism? Why don't we also make sure that they are more balanced or even more conservative schools for journalism? So that's the very, very first one. And the other one is also more on the psychological side. It says that it is actually easier for a simple civilian to defend himself or herself in the digital age. Is it really? Because it's true that the psychological pressure might be actually much, much stronger on his or her shoulders. But we said we shouldn't bite on their language, no? So I would say only his shoulders.
Well, I would take that first question for a second, which is...
And then, Ed, you also wanted to react.
Yeah. The greatest example of how rotten journalism school is, and we all know most higher education, that's why we're seeing in MCC, while we're seeing Marion Maréchal build a school in Lyon, we're seeing in Warsaw the Collegium Intermarium, the reactionaries are starting to react and push back to the monopolistic control and hijacking by radicals in higher education. But journalism school is the worst. About 8 or 10 years ago, when the BLM movement started, actually, was a situation in St. Louis. Michael Brown robs a gas station, gets into a fight with a cop shoots him, BLM starts. In University of Missouri, which is one of the 4 or 5 big J schools in America, along with Syracuse and Northwestern and Columbia, there was a journalism professor, Melissa Glick, and there were protests on campus, and students of color were hanging in the sort of main quad area, and one student with his iPhone wanted to document it, so he goes there with his phone, and she says to the protesters who have their own safe space, "We need some muscle here, get him out of here," because he's trying to document the radical protest that they're engaged in. And he said, "I'm just trying to be a citizen journalist, I just want to cover." She says, "Get me muscle, we need to physically remove him." She's a journalism school professor. I think that anecdote tells you how broken and rotten it is. I say burn them all down.
Thank you. Ed, you also wanted to react?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that question. I mean, one of the things of last summer with the protests, the imitation protests, was the Black Square and the Instagram. It was very, humans are naturally, we are almost like an eusocial species. We're incredibly social, and conformism is kind of instinctive, and it's one of the things why some of the people I meet in my daily life who are very centre left are just very nice people. They are nice people who want to be socially acceptable and want to not upset people and want to go along with what seems to be the right thing to do. So conformism has definitely, I think, accelerated with social media. The viral analogy, it allows ideas to spread at such a faster rate than before, which can be quite dangerous because we haven't had time to work out whether an idea is good or whether it's absolutely terrible. So yeah, that's why I'm slightly sort of more cynical about the idea that it kind of empowers us. I think most people are just going to sort of go along with whatever's strong.
Thank you. Stefano, you wanted to react? And also don't forget the other question on the psychological...
Just few seconds, because I usually see UK and USA as paradise of freedom. Because in Italy, for example, we have just one corporation of journalists protected by the state, and you have to make a state exam to be authorized to make the journalist work. So I think that you have to pass an exam, you have to also attend a lot of lessons, compulsory lessons, in order to be confirmed as a journalist by the state. And I think that that's the main problem. If you have a state that authorizes you to be a journalist or not, this is the main problem. Once you solve this problem and you can do this work freely with private companies, you have overcome the 2/3 of the problem, I think. But that's only an Italian opinion.
Thank you, thank you. I'm not the only Latino on stage today. Zoltán, maybe again in half a minute, please, but maybe, I don't know, if you want to conclude.
Please look for the rucksack of Rodrigo. It's very important that we find it.
Thank you very much. Without further notice, we're going to give back the floor. Thank you very much. Mi köszönjük.